I'm so excited for your new book, Dark Calories. So let's just like dive right into the deep end. What are dark calories? Where do they lurk in the modern food supply? And why should we avoid them?
Right. So, dark calories is the term I'm using to describe a collection of 8 vegetable seed oils that now compose 30% of our daily calories. On average, 30% are coming from vegetable oils. I call them the hateful eight, and they include corn, canola, cottonseed, soy, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, and grapeseed. And these oils are so abundant in the food supply, they have taken over our fat. The fats that we eat now are 80% coming from these oils instead of things like butter and the cheese and dairy fat and animal fats and coconut fat and other traditional fats that humans have always consumed. So it's 30% of our daily calories. And everybody knows that diet matters to health, yet doctors are not talking about how these oils might be affecting our health. Doctors don't even really learn what they are or why they're different from like traditional fats and why they're different, what makes them an absolutely uniquely dangerous food. Doctors don't know this. They don't know how they're made. They don't know what they are. It's not just doctors either, right? So, like, you've probably talked to enough doctors. We've talked about how we don't learn a ton about nutrition, but it's also dietitians. Dietitians don't learn what these oils do to us. And nobody is really having an honest conversation then about our actual diet and how it might be affecting our health, how even what the possibilities might even be. It's just not even discussed. And metabolic disease, we know, is due to diet. And metabolic disease is the number one biggest problem facing our country and really, frankly, our entire world these days. So it's absurd. It is absolutely absurd. And that's why I call the book Dark Calories, because they're hidden from us. And this is having bad effects, right? I wanted it to kind of register almost as like a horror story, because when it comes to our health, these vegetable oils or vegetable seed oils, the hateful eight, all kind of the same thing for the purposes of this conversation. Those things are the villains in our food supply that are making us sick and having these horrific effects on our health at a like statistic wide global statistic health deranging scale. They're shortening our lifespans. They're promoting obesity, metabolic disease, which diabetes is metabolic disease. Mental illness is metabolic disease. Everything is metabolic disease. It's all connected because metabolism is the fundamental like unit of our body's energy production systems, and energy is life.
Hmm. I think a lot of people today would perhaps be afraid to have this conversation because there's been such pushback on social media to this idea that seed oils, and to be specific, we're talking about the refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils, right? We're not talking about sesame seed oil. We're not talking about black seed oil. We're talking about these cooking oils, right, that have only existed in the food supply for the past 100 or so years, right?
Yes, because they're unique in terms of their chemistry, and they are also unique in terms of how they get manufactured. With 100 years ago, 150 years ago, we didn't have the technology to do this. And
Hmm.
so even though people on social media are talking about it, and I'm grateful that they are, the medical industry has never taken them seriously as a potential cause of anything. And so when people are, out there giving pushback, they're pushing back against, like, they're not really giving pushback. They're just maintaining the status quo,
Hmm.
because the status quo is to ignore these things and what they do to our health. And all the supposed research, I have to say it's supposed, because there's flaws in all of the studies, and major flaws. And I don't know if you wanted to go into that, if that's been something that you've seen a lot or been concerned about. Maybe it's made you even question whether they really are all that bad, if you've seen a lot of this pushback.
Yeah, I love that that direction because I personally avoid them. Like I keep them out of my kitchen, but there's no doubt that I'm being exposed to them when I eat out. I mean, and I eat out a fair amount. Um, and part of I think why I continue to voice concern for these oils. I think even if I knew nothing of the science, I still wonder why health experts, credentialed health experts, seem to be so readily going to bat for companies like Mazola and the producers of these seed oils, which now infiltrate the human food supply. Seemingly every ultra processed food incorporates them to some degree, and I just as a from a precautionary principle standpoint, these are novel fats. These are novel oils that have gone through innumerable industrial processing steps. And so, yeah, I'd love if you could actually unpack the science of why you believe these oils to be uniquely harmful.
Yes, they definitely are uniquely harmful. And by the time we're done with this conversation, I sincerely hope to convince you that you also want to avoid them in restaurants too. And it's, not that hard. I mean, it's not easy, but it's doable, right? You can
Hmm.
do it and it's worth it. So that's what I want to convince you of. And you can tell me if I've convinced you or not, because I want your honest opinion. And if like, that's what this is all about, is really helping people who haven't heard of them, as well as people who have but have also kind of been like, yeah, I kind of avoid them when I can. And do I need to work any harder? Is that, that's a very important question. The answer is I 100% yes,
Hmm.
because these oils are actually the most toxic thing in the food supply. And the reason for that has to do with their chemistry and how we treat them during the refining. And then, of course, what happens after that. And it all boils down to one single concept, and that is oxidation, and how oxygen interacts with the fatty acids in these seed oils, which are very high in polyunsaturates. Now, polyunsaturated fatty acids are both come in two major forms that are essential to our diets: omega-3 and omega-6. So we call them essential fatty acids. And I think that's a big part of why nutritionists and dietitians are kind of loath to call them out, because they know and they learn, unlike doctors. Certainly, I did not learn this in medical school, but also it was quite a while ago, so things may have changed. But they know that that omega-3 and omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids are essential to health. They are like, our membranes are made out of these types of fatty acids. When I say our membranes, I mean our cellular membranes, which need to be fluid, and these polyunsaturates help impart that. They're important signaling chemicals. They help us respond to infection. They can help clot our blood. They can help deliver babies. They can help, break down ends of broken bones, so that this is an inflammatory process. They regulate inflammation, and they also are very important to vision and our brain and our IQs, and they're building blocks, so literally, of our brain too, and our nervous system. So I think that might be a big part of it, because they learn that these things are essential, and they also learn something else about the opposite kind of fat, the saturated fats that are in the solid fats, the animal fats, the things like butter. A saturated fat is something our bodies can make, And that's the difference, right? So our bodies can make saturated fat, but they cannot make these essential polyunsaturated fatty acids. And so just the thinking has been for many decades, and for very sinister reasons that are important to understand, but the thinking has been since the 1950s that if we eat too much saturated fat, it's going to clog our arteries or raise our cholesterol or just be bad. So the thinking has been that these things are just bad, and there has not been any consideration of the chemistry in the mainstream, like medical kind of thinking. But there's been intense consideration of the chemistry by the chemists who produce the oils, and they are not talking to doctors. They are not part of the dietitian and medical conversation, but they know that these things react with oxygen when you heat them, when you cook with them, and when they do, it's really bad because those reactions transform the essential fatty acids that could be good for us into toxic compounds, serious toxic compounds, not like small amounts of minimally toxic things, but potentially very large amounts of extraordinarily toxic things. And one of the lipid scientists that I interviewed for the book Dark Calories, he did some research about probably 20 years ago now that showed that French fries, when you cook French fries, or when you just take French fries that were cooked in liquid vegetable oil from a place like McDonald's, they actually contain as much toxin, certain type of toxin that causes cancer and all kinds of bad things. It's called alpha beta aldehyde, as a pack of cigarettes, as smoking a pack of cigarettes. So it's not insignificant, right? That means basically it's 1-to-1. One French fry has about the toxicity of a cigarette. And so this is something that dietitians, I don't think they've heard this, because the people who are doing these studies and talking about it, that was not part of my medical education. It's just these types of chemists are absolutely excluded from conversations. I have never seen any of these types of chemists invited to talk at any medical education conferences. I've never seen any of their research published in anything that a dietitian or a doctor would read. It doesn't make it into JAMA. It doesn't make it into American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, things that doctors read. And so they just haven't heard even the tip of the iceberg about how bad these things could potentially be. And what I've just described is chapter 1 of Dark Calories. There's a bunch more chapters that describe how these things actually make us sick.
Well, would you agree that there seems to be a paucity of human, like, randomized controlled data to show these potentially harmful effects in humans? I mean,
yes, there should be more, but there isn't none. And in fact, sorry, go ahead. I interrupted you.
Well, yeah, I mean, because, like, I feel like it would be a much easier case to make if we had, and it would seem that these would be really, that these studies would be really easy to do, right? You feed some people a bunch of French fries and you show some kind of inflammatory effect, you show some kind of negative, effect on subjects' biology, but that data, well, at least, I'm not super familiar with it. There seems to be a lot of pushback when you talk about these mechanistic studies on social media. A lot of people in the so-called evidence-based community will say that there's a paucity of randomized clinical data to back up, these more mechanistic studies, or insights rather. And so how do you reconcile that? I buy that there are these toxins found in French fries, but there seems to be a dearth of human clinical data connecting those mechanisms to poor health outcomes in humans.
Right. So, well, there actually is great data. It's just that we're not counting it as data, or it has been dismissed by the academics who have conflicts of interest within the oil industry.
Hmm.
So there's an enormous amount of data. It's not all human clinical trials because, well, there actually was there were two very large and well done human clinical trials that should have made like the headlines. They should have changed. Those two studies were so large and so well done and so uh, like long duration that they really should have changed the conversation. But instead, they were buried. Like the results were absolutely buried. Like it wasn't published at all. And it wasn't until a medical researcher from the National Institute of Health recognized that a grant had been funded, a couple of grants had been funded for each of these studies, that didn't seem to have ever been like produced any data out of it. So he literally had to dig around in somebody's basement of the person who had actually been involved in one of these two studies, actually the better of the two, which was double blinded and randomized.
Is this
So
the
it was
Minnesota Coronary Survey?
yes, yes, and
Yeah.
that was Chris Ramsden at the National Institute of Health, and that study showed after about an average of I think it was 3 to 4 years of participation in the study, thousands of people, that the hypothesis of the authors was that the vegetable oils would indeed lower cholesterol, and that the second part of the hypothesis was that would result in fewer deaths. And the first part turned out to be true. So many years later, they published a bit about that, these authors. But they never published the second part, which is the fact that more people died.
Wow.
And they were dying of infection, they were dying of cancer, and it's not clear whether or not they were dying of a heart disease, because there was a lot of slides that were just gone, and there wasn't enough numbers to really be sure what had happened there with heart disease. But I think this is like overlooked, right? Like this was important, and it was important when it happened. It was covered up. And then when Chris Ramsden published it in the British Medical Journal, very reputable journal, in 2016, it was covered up again by Walter Willett at Harvard, who basically said, this is as direct of a quote as I can remember, it's an interesting historical footnote that has no bearing on nutrition science today. Now,
Wow.
that is a lie. That is the opposite of what's true. If it were published and he had, instead of lying, had said, wow, this is really important, we might need to reconsider. It does beg that we reconsider at least the idea that lowering cholesterol was healthy and that these oils are not dangerous,
Wow.
right? But he said otherwise. And to do that tells you something very important. That tells you there's other research out there that has been either not done in the first place, or if it were, suppressed. Because I'm sure it's not a one-off response from Walter Willett at Harvard. And he was like the dean at the time of the School of Nutrition Science or Public Health. A very important guy. So this was not just somebody, flipping off with an opinion. This was somebody whose opinion other doctors trust, dietitians trust, and he didn't tell the truth. So that we cannot ignore.
Well, I think some additional context might be helpful. I mean, Walter, for people who are unfamiliar with the landscape of nutrition science, I mean, he's well known for, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have any, other, if you have a different perspective, but I believe he's known for having a very plant-based sort of bias, right? People might think, oh, well, he represents Harvard. Harvard is an Ivy League institution. It's like one of the top schools in the country, if not the world. But nonetheless, he has long had a leaning towards uh, a more plant based way of eating. He's long you know skewed away from animal source foods. A lot of the fear mongering that comes out around red meat and other animal source highly nutritious foods come from Harvard.
Yes.
Uh, they most recently published that study linking red meat to type 2 diabetes, which was like an incredibly flawed paper in and of itself. Like, I don't think anybody with a sentient mind would 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 suggest that red meat is causal in type 2 diabetes, but that nonetheless, that's a study that they decided to undertake and publish on.
Let me stop you right there, because this is what's missing from the entire conversation. What is the mechanism by which red meat could possibly cause diabetes? That's missing. That they don't point that out. So anyway, go ahead and continue.
Yeah, well, I just think that that additional context is important when you're saying that he
Downplayed it. Yes.
downplayed this data.
Yes, it's important. However, I'm my own devil's advocate sometimes, and I would say he would make a case that, I have this opinion because of evidence, and then he would go on to cite a bunch of evidence. So I don't see that as a huge red flag. What I see as a red flag is when, like what I said, he's lying about the significance of a study. That is a lie. And so that is a red flag. And that means that's a person I'm not going to trust again, ever. And who supports this person? Who puts him in this position of power and influence? Harvard. And who agrees with him? Tufts, Stanford, every other Ivy League institution, most of preventative cardiology. You see, so like the common sense cascade needs to include everyone else who supports the liars.
Well, it also fits. I mean, as you said in that study, they found that these seed oils did reduce cholesterol, which fits perfectly into the narrative pushed by the pharmaceutical, ultra processed food agricultural complex that really has put LDL cholesterol, has sort of exalted it to it's sort of like their religion, that
Yeah, it is actually. And cardiologists will seriously say it's just a bad player, like as if it has no function in the body. And the level of LDL cholesterol that's considered normal is now going to be adjusted down again. So it's already been adjusted down at least 6 times since I've been in practice. It used to be 160. It used to be 190 actually, or less was normal. But it's gone ratcheted down, and now it's like if you're high risk, it's 70, but they're thinking about bringing it down to 50, or I've even seen people propose 20.
And those are like newborn levels, right, of LDL cholesterol.
Those are starvation levels. I'm not sure that a healthy newborn has levels that low either. A healthy newborn whose mother did not eat seed oils, because they lower cholesterol, right? So we can't do averages based on the population to know what a normal is if you accept the premise that seed oils are unhealthy. And if you just realize that seed oils lower cholesterol, right? So then you can't just, use population studies anymore as the basis for normal in newborns, right? We just can't, because newborns have all been essentially fed seed oils. They go right through the placenta. They affect, the seed oils are bad because not just because of the fact that they contain toxins, but here's the other part of it. They build up in our body fat, and when they do, they deplete our body of antioxidants. That includes vitamin E, that includes glutathione, and that includes all the enzyme systems that our bodies need to control oxygen energy in our body. And when we can't control oxygen energy in our body, that is metabolic disease, because metabolism is all about energy, and a healthy metabolism has to be able to control energy. When we can no longer control energy, we develop this state of oxidative stress, high energy particles flying around in our cells that cause inflammation and lead to all inflammatory disease, and they also cause cellular premature death and degenerative disease. So chapter 2 of Dark Calories is called the all-you-can-eat buffet of chronic disease, because 30% of our calories in our diet means that every all-you-can-eat buffet you go to, all the cruises you go to, all the restaurants you go to, the hospitals, the schools, universities, etc., you get the idea. Everywhere you go out to eat, you're eating vegetable oils. Vegetable oils cause our bodies to lose the ability. They kill our body's ability to control energy because they deplete our body of antioxidants. Antioxidants are so essential to life that without them, this goes back 2 billion years to early life on Earth when we were all just single-celled organisms. Without them, when oxygen started to build up in the atmosphere, because early life had no oxygen, that little bit of oxygen started oxidizing the cell membranes. What part of the cell membranes? Well, the polyunsaturated fatty acids first. And that started just killing off everything. And life almost disappeared. The paleo microbiologists say. And the only thing that saved us was the development of antioxidants, and antioxidants that sat in the cell membrane that could trap the free radicals, and antioxidant enzymes that recharge those antioxidants. Because an antioxidant is a one-time thing, one free radical, one antioxidant. But when you have vegetable oils in your diet and oxidative stress disrupting your metabolism, you're creating billions. In one single cell, you can create billions of free radicals in a single second within the membrane. So you need to have many, many defenses against these things. And so we do. A lot of our enzymes, actually the fastest enzyme in the human body is an antioxidant enzyme. It's either catalase or superoxide dismutase. I can't remember which one right now, but those battle out of control oxygen. They help keep energy in our cells under control. And so chapter 2 talks about how this condition called oxidative stress is the root cause state of all of these diseases that modern medicine now has no explanation for, but will treat with medications. So really, what modern medicine is doing is utterly failing to address the root cause. And they're perfectly happy with that, because instead of addressing root causes, which can only be addressed with better diet, they create these things that they call risk factors, like hypertension is a risk factor, high cholesterol is a risk factor, even though it's not really. High blood sugar is a risk factor, being overweight is a risk factor. And they use medications to make these risk factors look better on paper. And that is the pharmaceutical industry in a nutshell. That's why the pharmaceutical industry is the most powerful industry in the country, because doctors and medical science are not interested in understanding the root cause of disease. And it's very simple. It's oxidative stress. I figured it out, and I'm not even at a university, and I'm not even super old. It took me a lot of years, though.
Well, I love that you brought up the topic of antioxidants, and I want to read Chris Master. Are you familiar with Chris Masterjohn? He's a PhD in nutrition science. So he posted a fantastic thread on X recently that I want to, read out and just see if you agree with his points, because I thought he articulated this really well. He said that seed oils don't cause oxidative stress; they increase vulnerability to oxidative damage, which I think is a nuance that's important, particularly when you hear all these claims on social media that seed oils are inflammatory. So they don't necessarily, I think what he's suggesting is that they don't automatically peroxidize. They don't automatically create inflammation, but they do make you more vulnerable to oxidative damage, because these seed oils are so chemically unstable, and you put that in the context of a diet that is typically, at least in the context of the standard American diet, very low in antioxidants, And a lot of the time when we're consuming these seed oils, they're in fact already damaged because we're getting them out of the fryer, in our restaurants, in the
Well,
restaurant
and
setting.
so when they're damaged, they turn into compounds that are toxins, and toxins promote oxidative stress, right? So the
Hmm.
food cooked in seed oils will contain toxins. That's inevitable. But toxins have always been part of life since we've been cooking. But the amount of them in the foods cooked in seed oils is capable of overwhelming our liver so that it can't eliminate the toxins, and then it ends up in our bloodstream and then in our tissues. And those toxins do promote oxidative stress. So there's a nuance to his nuance, and I'm sure he probably knows it too. But uh, the foods cooked in these oils promote oxidative stress. Now, what he's talking about, though, what he's referring to is something else very important, and perhaps he touches on this too. I don't know. I mean, I'm familiar with his work, and he and I are pretty much on the same, almost on identical page as this. I've been writing about these since 2004, and I've actually written a lot of stuff. And I don't know if he's read my stuff, I've read his stuff, if we've influenced each other, but we seem to stay on the same page over the years. And um, and the the vegetable oils building up in our body fat in particular is a unique thing. This is an experiment that we've run on the American and now the global population. We have these polyunsaturated fatty acids in our body fat at concentrations never before seen in history that would not really be possible without seed oils in the food supply. And so what am I talking about? Like a normal human polyunsaturated body fat composition might be 2 to 5%. We don't really know. But our best data has to be old data now because these oils are all over the world, or in very remote populations, says 2 to 5%. Now the average in 2000 and as of 2008, according to the most updated study, was somewhere around 15 to 20%, with
Mm.
outliers as high as 30 to 40%. And since vegetable oils have increased significantly, most likely human adipose composition has continued to change in this altered new direction. And what that means, and here's why they do also another nuance that I haven't heard anybody talking about, and this is very important. And this comes out of I first talked about this in the Fat Burn Fix, but I talk about it in different context in Dark Calories. But what it means is that when we mobilize our body fat, between meals, when we aren't eating, we mobilize our body fat. Polyunsaturated fatty acids enter our mitochondria. Our mitochondria has energized oxygen, and it will lead to oxidative stress. And one of the studies that I cite in Dark Calories shows an experiment that proves that when mitochondria burn polyunsaturated fatty acids, it shuts down their ability to control that energy. They stop producing ATP energy. They shut down. They stop producing it. They shut down either 100% eventually because they die, but pretty quickly they shut down very significantly, and they start releasing free radicals and producing oxidative stress. And the reason that this kills the mitochondria and the cells is because of oxidative stress. So I would argue that while he is correct in one sense that they don't cause oxidative stress, if you think about the body as a whole organism, you have to realize that it's changing our body fat, and that means it's changing how our cells generate energy, and you have to consider how the mitochondria process these things. So I would agree in part, but I think there's other parts that are overlooked. And frankly, this is complicated science. Humans are complex organisms, and Dark Calories is the first book that pieces all these different scientific ideas and findings together into one cohesive story that makes it clear, that argues strongly that these are absolutely the reason ultra processed food is so bad for us, that a recent study showed that I think a single serving of it per day increases your chance of metabolic disease by a significant chunk, like 8% or something, a single serving per day on average. So, and that's not even with a very good definition of what ultra processed food is, because we're relying on Tufts and Harvard, who have relationships with the processed food industry, to define ultra processed food. And again, that's another kink in the idea that human clinical trials are the gold standard, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, if you want to, I can just rattle down, 4 of the major problems with all of the human clinical trials that I've seen, and that's not all the problems, but it's the 4 major ones.
Yeah, please. And I think it's important to underscore like that I'm on the same page. I avoid them as best as I can, and even in the restaurant setting, I'm unwittingly exposed to them, but I don't, I know not to order fried food, because I know that that's just like a toxic shitstorm.
Yeah,
Because who knows? That's the worst of the worst. So I'm very much on the same page as you. I like to play devil's advocate, even to my own biases, because I think it's important.
You have to. I do that too.
Yeah, particularly today when,
Myself.
You so much as mention a concern around seed oils on social media, and it's like people, again, in the so-called evidence-based community, it's like they get out their pitchforks, and I think we need to be able to have this conversation, right? I mean, it's scientific to be able to have this conversation, right, and to question the status quo. I think it's important. So yeah, what are the 4 major pitfalls that you would say with regard to these, the pre-existing data set that we have access to?
Right. So probably the biggest one is that they aren't done long enough. So because we have to consider that they build up in our body fat, and we have to consider the metabolic effects of having them distort our body fat composition to such high PUFA that it's like 4 to 5 or 6 or maybe 10 times what our metabolism can handle. That takes years. And I have not seen recent studies that go on very long, most of them are a few weeks. And so when folks are out there throwing numbers, like saying, well, there's 30 studies that are human clinical trials that show that they don't cause insulin resistance, or show that they actually improve insulin resistance, supposedly, one or the other, right? They're not clear actually on that, but those studies are too short, because you need to account for how they harm us. And one of the ways is by building up in our body fat, which simply takes time. And that's something that, very few people in this space are sounding the alarm about. But, some are. It's not just me. Other people agree, right?
Correct.
So
yes.
That's one important flaw. And another one is the dose, right? So they're currently on average about 30% of our calories. Now, I've seen studies that are not only too short, but also their high seed oil arm is much lower than the current dose. So the way that they measure inflammation or oxidative stress in studies like that can actually improve because compared to baseline. And I've seen this happen where they're comparing it to baseline. They're not comparing them to each other in the results. So, but when so this gets lost in the meta-analysis, this little detail of the fact that they're not comparing seed oils to a saturated fat diet. They're not comparing those two things. They're comparing the change from baseline. And they're saying, look, it doesn't cause a problem, so it's not a problem. That gets lost in the meta-analysis, which is another reason that we have to be extremely cautious about meta-analyses. And it's foolish to call them the most the like the pinnacle of research in nutrition. They're the pinnacle of research in drug studies when outcomes are unclear, when and only when outcomes are unclear otherwise, right? So that's just a false statement that meta-analysis is the gold standard. That's false.
So you're saying that oftentimes in these studies, the intervention will be a dose of seed oils that's actually lower than what these subjects had already been consuming as
At baseline.
consumers of the standard American diet.
Right.
And this differs from drug trials where the baseline exposure of a given
Zero.
drug is often zero.
Of course. But exactly. Well put. Perfect. Yes. So that's another very important flaw. And it's a fatal flaw for many of these studies. Now, another flaw that I probably should have mentioned earlier is most of the studies on mix up vegetable oil and total PUFA, right? So again, these meta-analyses they cite them to say vegetable oil is not a problem. They mix up studies that include total PUFA, and total PUFA is not the same as vegetable oil. What's the difference? Antioxidants and lack of toxin, right? So if you're getting more PUFA from whole foods, that include fish, that includes, superfoods, that I think you mentioned in one of your books. Yeah. So that's not a problem. And I don't know, I can't speak for everyone who's decrying seed oils, but I never said total PUFA is the problem. It's vegetable oils that are a problem. And vegetable oils, they can increase the total PUFA in our body fat. And I think you can't get that much PUFA in your body fat from eating whole foods. And also, even if you did, it's a different scenario because it would come along with a lot of antioxidants and vitamins, and our body would be possibly able to handle it. We don't know. That experiment hasn't been done. And I don't think it needs to be done. So, and then there's one more thing I wanted to mention, and that is surrogate endpoints. So a surrogate endpoint, for example, is LDL. It's the classic surrogate endpoint for preventing heart attacks. If you can lower someone's LDL cholesterol, doctors believe that means you are preventing them from having a heart attack. And so we just talked about how vegetable oils actually lower LDL cholesterol. They lower total cholesterol too. So often that's a surrogate endpoint that's used to show that these things have benefits. But there's other surrogate endpoints that are used, and that's what they have to do in these short-term studies, right? When the studies aren't done long enough to show real disease developing, like heart attacks, dementia, cancer, strokes, that takes years, they use surrogate endpoints. They have to, by definition, because they're not long enough to show a hard endpoint. And these surrogate endpoints are simply not up to the task. One of the biggest, problems I see with even the anti-seed oil crew when they talk about why they're bad is they focus on omega-6 and inflammation. And that's not the problem. That's a small problem, but it's not the root problem, right? That is a mechanistic problem. What I'm talking about is a problem of physics. It is a physical fact, it's reality that oxygen and these polyunsaturates react and produce toxins that can have, or that are shown to have, destructive effects on our mitochondria, right? So I'm not talking about some theoretical mechanism that's only, can be shown in cells. I'm talking about basic chemistry that is taught in textbooks and that is used to synthesize, plastic and drugs and to try to keep the food supply safe with antioxidants.
So I just want to go back to your third point. So when we do studies that look at, for example, linoleic acid in subjects, and they see that people with like higher levels of, linoleic acid actually have reduced risk for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, that's confounded by the fact that you have obviously vegetable oils is massive. They're a massive contributor of linoleic acid to the body. But on the other hand, very healthful foods also are very high in linoleic acid, right?
Exactly.
Like nuts, seeds,
So that's
fish.
exactly. So that's not a meaningful data point. It's if people want clinical trials, then we need to do clinical trials and we need to do them for long enough. And when we did that and we had those, the people in power said, don't pay any attention.
Hmm. Wow. What would you say the biggest misconceptions, or I guess, among, because now you have people on social media that are, that have basically pointed at these seed oils as being the sole smoking gun for all of our health ills. And they'll say that they're the reason why obesity, exists. They'll say, what would you say are the biggest, I guess, misconceptions about them? Because certainly there have to be some misconceptions circulating on social media about these seed oils, right? Like in order to, I think, convince the nutritional orthodoxy and the medical establishment about their potential harms, I think we do need to be talking about them in a more sort of accurate and nuanced way. So would you say there are any misconceptions that are worth debunking about these oils today on social media?
Well, I mean, it depends who who we're talking about. So if we're talking about like the seed oil, like major avoiders, they're talking about them being toxic because they are also used for like engine lubricant and pesticides and stuff like that. And that is a very weak argument because any oil can you spray it in a fine mist and it will clog the breathing holes of insects. You can use
Hmm.
olive oil to do that. So that's a funny thing to say because it's true. They're not going to use olive oil for insecticide because it's too expensive. So canola oil is, kind of becomes the fall guy there. But I don't like talking about that because it is a straw man, right?
Hmm.
You can knock that one down with what I just said. Um, and the same thing that they'll say like engine lubricant or lamp oil. I mean, people used whale oil for all those things. And I would argue that other than the killing of a, amazing creature, which I would never condone, whale oil itself would be extremely healthy. It would be like fish oil, basically, right?
Hmm.
So it would be extremely healthy for people. And yet, it was used for lamp oil, engine lubricant, making soap, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of like a facile fifth grade level argument. And hey, it's all right with me because it's also true that these things are bad. And it opened the door to a lot of people looking deeper into the conversation. So I don't have a problem with that, but I think it's important not to use that as your main argument against other scientists.
Yeah. Is there no risk to over-consuming saturated fat? I mean, I'm a proud omnivore. I advocate for, the consumption of red meat. I think it's an incredibly healthful food. It's super nutrient dense, a fantastic source of protein. But when it comes to refined fats that are predominated by saturated fatty acids, is there no potential risk to over-consuming saturated fats?
Well, I know you don't mean this, but I need to say this. Over consuming by definition is harmful, right? Just by its own definition. So let me ask you, what do you really mean? Like let's say we're not overeating calories or causing some sort of dietary imbalance because we're not getting enough nutrients because we're just eating nothing but say like refined coconut oil, which has very little nutrition, but lots of saturated fat, right? So let's say that's not what's happening. What do you mean? Like, how could that happen? In what circumstance? And then I'll answer the question.
Well, I guess, what I've come to realize is that pretty much every nutrient, every food item, when overfed, is going to create distinct problems.
Yeah, by
It's like,
definition,
yeah,
right?
we,
Overfed, overdoing it. That's not good.
yeah,
Balance, right?
yeah. Now, on the
So the
other hand,
question, I guess maybe what you're really asking, sorry to interrupt again, but I think maybe I understand your question better now. How much is too much? Is there such a thing as too much in the context? Like, what is the number that's too much,
mhm,
right?
yeah,
Is it 10%, 20%, 30%? And I would say that that's a question for another planet. Because on this planet, I think we shouldn't be thinking about eating saturated fat. We should be thinking about eating food.
Yes.
And that's what I've advocated for, dozens of years now.
Yeah. Well, I have no concern about eating saturated fat in the context of whole foods. I eat red meat all the time. I eat wild salmon. Fish has saturated fat in it, contrary to seemingly the popular narrative that fish is somehow magically like this incredibly healthful food, but red meat is the worst food you could possibly eat.
Right. Uh-huh.
Salmon also has saturated fat in it. Farm salmon having more than wild salmon.
And red meat is most often in the store. It doesn't even have the fat on it anymore. It's trimmed because
Yeah.
people pay by the pound and they don't want to pay for fat, which they perceive as waste. So really the main time where we would be getting fat from red meat is in ground beef or, pre-made foods. So that's ridiculous. Failure to consider that reality of our food supply. Again, the dietitians and the people talking about saturated fat being bad, they're not considering the totality of what we're actually eating. And that's, my job. That's what I've been doing for over 20 years now, is looking at the biggest possible picture so I can get at the most absolute truth, the most unassailable truth. And that's how I came up with the concept of what even is health. Health is the ability to control energy in our bodies. And vegetable oils, because of their high polyunsaturated fatty acid content and the toxins that they deliver when we cook with them, deplete our body's ability to control energy. They deplete our antioxidants. And this invites death and disease into our bodies. So vegetable oils really are oxidative stress in a bottle. And that's why they are the number one thing to avoid. I haven't made this point yet, but I argue in Dark Calories that they are way worse than sugar. And partly for the simple reason that when we overeat sugar, at least it builds body fat that our body can control. Our body can control the saturated and monounsaturated fats in our body fat. That's another reason we can't really overeat saturated fat, because let's say we need a certain amount of monounsaturated fat, our body can convert saturated into monounsaturated fat. It does that all the time. And when it makes body fat out of excess sugar and carbohydrates, some of that is saturated and some of that is monounsaturated. That's what ends up getting stored. So it creates a body fat balance that has the right kinds of energetic fuels for our mitochondria to be able to generate energy. And the best fuel is that monounsaturated fat. When our body is in charge of our body fat composition, it's mostly monounsaturated fat in there.
And monounsaturated fat is most abundantly found in olive oil, avocado oil, most famously. Yeah. Yeah, the glucose thing is not really a concern, or at least not as much of a concern, because you get a physiologic, spike in your blood sugar, and then your pancreas secretes insulin. It shuttles that sugar away. You burn it off as a fuel, or you store it as fat. Whereas these oils can linger for years.
Well, and I spoke to one of the researchers that I interviewed for Dark Calories. She said that they build up in our bodies like a toxin. Like, she described polyunsaturated fatty acids as having toxic effects directly. They behave like a toxin, and because of their effect on mitochondria, they have toxic effects. And so that, I think, is that is not based on, animal studies. This is based on physics. This is based on what you would predict. And when you do animal studies to test these hypotheses, you find exactly what chemistry would predict. And that's why I say that what I'm talking about are principles of chemistry, which is to say principles of physics. And that means that to say vegetable oils don't cause oxidative stress, especially when consumed in the amount we are now, is defying the physics of the universe And do you really need more controlled trials, clinical trials to test something? That's an extraordinary claim you're making, that these oils are, well, they used to be called healthy. I don't know if you remember that, but like not too long ago, dietitians were saying these oils are healthy. And the dean of Tufts, Dariush Mozaffarian, is still saying we need to eat more of them, even though they're already 30% of our dietary calories. And
Well,
he says,
his latest contribution to the nutritional zeitgeist was the food compass, which seemed to indicate that Lucky Charms and egg substitute fried in vegetable oil was healthier than a poached egg and ground beef and dairy and things like that. So I think we can clearly see where his bias lies.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is like for anyone out there who's kind of confused about the conflicting information. My response is to like, how do you know who to trust? All these experts seem to, have different strong opinions. Who do you really trust? My simple answer is, if somebody's lied to me once, I don't trust them anymore. And all of these people promoting seed oils have lied multiple times.
Yeah. What about the criticism that, by hyperfixating on these oils, it's a distraction. You're missing. It causes people to lose sight of the forest for the trees. That really people just ought to reduce their consumption of ultra processed foods, which now make up 60% of the calories that your average consumes on a daily basis.
Why are ultra processed foods bad for us? I'm answering your question with a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. Well,
why are they bad? What do they do?
Well, I think the seed oils play a role, but you could say that they're engineered to be hyper palatable. We don't tire of eating them. They're highly calorie dense. They have other industrial additives, intentional or not, that are in that milieu that are not good for our health. For example, endocrine disrupting compounds and the like. There's a whole milieu that makes them not good for us.
So would you agree then that what they do is they have some toxicity in them, at least some, and they are deprived of nutrients, right? Would you agree that that's why they're bad?
Yeah.
So they're low nutrient, high in toxicity. Those two things promote oxidative stress, and that's what kills us. Now, there is nothing in the food supply that promotes oxidative stress more powerfully than vegetable oils because of chemistry. Right. And because the dose makes the poison. And those other additives, we consume those in like parts per billion, parts per million maybe at the most, maybe milligrams a day. We consume vegetable oils in ounces per day. That's millions or billions of times more. The dose makes the poison. And so I think we need to talk about these more than we have, because they are right now the worst thing in the food supply by volume. And if we want to help somebody be healthy, I think there's so many bad things in the food supply. It can be overwhelming to say, pay attention to this and that and the other thing. And what I've done by saying vegetable oils are the defining feature of junk food. They are what vegetable oils make junk food junk. And they're the main thing to pay attention to. That's the first thing we should be getting out of our food supply. It helps you clarify, right? And then so that you're not overwhelmed, so that you can start with a simple thing. And if you can do this one thing, which is every time you're going to buy something that's in a package with an ingredients label, turn that package around and scan the ingredients for vegetable oils. Because if you can turn a package around, you can turn your metabolism around. It's that powerful.
Well, if you have like a confectionery product, like say a cake, right? And you swap out the vegetable oil for butter or for avocado oil, that doesn't suddenly make the confectionery product good for you, right?
Well, I mean, no, I don't know that. I don't think anyone out there is suggesting that either, right? No, that's not what we are saying, right?
Well, I don't want you to be mischaracterized, because your work, which I think is so important to be mischaracterized, because I'm a as I mentioned, I'm a fan and I avoid these, but I also think it's important to be nuanced because today everybody seems to be talking about them and there seems to be a lot of miscommunication about the potential harms. And I think if anybody is
Right.
suited to deliver this in a way that can make a difference, it's you. So that's just a criticism that I've seen, and I agree with it. That, like, if you have like a cupcake, and I'm not saying cupcakes are bad. You can have a cupcake here and there. It's not going to sway your health in any direction, positive or negative. But like a food that is objectively a junk food, right? Swapping out the oil is not going to make a huge difference.
Suddenly a health food. No, because
Right.
healthy food needs to have nutrients and building blocks, right? And so just because you remove something that's toxic and full of empty calories and replace it with something that at least isn't toxic and may have some nutrients, because if we're talking about butter versus some of the refined oils that are in my middle group of okay but not great, right? Like palm oil, that's okay but not great, because palm oil is very saturated, it's very stable, but there's refined almost no nutrients in it, right? So that's okay. I'm not going to say it's toxic. I'm not going to say it's necessarily a deal breaker in a given food, right? But just removing the toxic thing and replacing it with something that's slightly better doesn't somehow make all the other ingredients nutritious. And I think if somebody out there is saying that that's what the seed oil argument is, you should unfollow them. They're being absurd. That's absurd to suggest that. I hadn't actually seen that, so thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, of course. I think it's pretty easy to keep canola oil, corn oil, soybean oil out of your home, and people absolutely should get more familiar with nutrition facts, labels, and ingredients lists and the like. How do you avoid these exposure to these oils when you're eating out?
Yeah, so eating out is a challenge, but there's ways to navigate it. And what I do myself is I don't bother. I don't do this. I learned this the hard way. Do not say, "Hey, what kind of oil are you using?" They won't know, and it means that they don't really know. If you ask that open-ended question, they don't really know what you're after, right? They don't know what the right answer is. So tell them the right answer. Do this instead. Do you have anything back there that you can cook in butter? And I mean butter, not margarine or butter oil. Or say the same thing with olive oil, right? And then you have to caveat that too. I mean 100% olive oil, not a blend, right? But I personally prefer butter. It tastes better. So like that's just one tip. And I have dozens more in the last part of the book, because in order to rehabilitate our metabolism, it doesn't just come down to avoiding vegetable oils. We also need nutrients, right? And one of the nutrients we've been terrified of is cholesterol. Cholesterol is a nutrient. And so I spend some time helping people understand the benefits of cholesterol to the body and the benefits of having high LDL cholesterol. Because the idea that LDL cholesterol causes heart disease is fabricated. It was fabricated. It is not true. And I talk about the history of that idea. You've probably had I'm sure maybe your listeners are a little bit familiar with that idea, but maybe they don't know that that idea comes from the American Heart Association, which is not a government organization. Like a lot of folks out there don't trust the government, and they just like say, oh yeah, of course, don't trust the American Heart Association. It's important to know that they're not a government organization because they are a private medical organization, and they educate doctors and dietitians and everyone with a license about what a healthy diet looks like. And the American Heart Association accepts money from vegetable oils and created a lie about animal fat. And I tell that story and the history of all that and who was involved and how it played out in the middle section of the book, Dark Calories. And it's a very important story because if you take away this myth of cholesterol, then nobody would have ever believed that vegetable oils could be healthy because they were you have to remember, they were first promoted as heart healthy. Now, maybe your audience doesn't even see them that way, and the argument is, are they neutral or are they the worst thing in the food supply or something in between? But they used to be promoted as heart healthy.
Hmm.
And again, this gets back to, if somebody lies once, don't trust them. And these people, the American Heart Association, who lied about vegetable oils being the healthiest kind of fat out there, they're the ones who are leading the medical thought. They're leading what doctors think a healthy diet looks like. And that means that when you go to get a physical exam, you're entering a system that is designed to make you sick. Because if you're healthy, doctors will think that's a problem, because healthy people tend to have higher cholesterol, period.
Is there a U-shaped curve, or are you saying, because I'm, some
Tend
people,
to. I said tend to, right? Tend to. Yeah. So like if you're starving, if you're on a diet, your cholesterol can go down. Certainly everything is a U-shaped curve. But on average, healthier people have higher cholesterol. And this is another study that people don't talk about. But when you look at what are the cholesterol levels of people in the hospital with a heart attack, are they low or are they high? They're low. They were low before they had their heart attack. That was a study that came out of the VA system in 2009 or so. And it showed that people who just had a heart attack, you would think that having lower cholesterol would be protective, right? I mean, if everything is right. But it turns out that having lower cholesterol was not protective. The people in the hospital with a heart attack tended to already have had lower cholesterol. So by extension, possibly, and I think this is true, the people with higher cholesterol are less likely to have a heart attack. And why do studies always show otherwise? Well, that's just a question of, follow the statistical manipulations, which aren't published, by the way. They do not publish the details of how they adjust their statistics. And that is how they hide a lot of the truth about what's really going on with diet and nutrition, by adjusting for things.
Well, I'm certainly in agreement that eating a healthful omnivorous diet is going to lead to higher cholesterol than, somebody who's on a nutrient deficient plant-based diet. And in fact, when you look at newborns who are breastfed, they have higher cholesterol than newborns that are formula fed. So I mean,
Of course, because formula is full of seed oils, right?
Yeah. But on the other hand, people will refute that claim that people, those who have heart attacks, 50%, I think the statistic is something like 50% of people who have a heart attack do so with normal cholesterol levels or something like that, or even low cholesterol levels, that there's reverse causation, that sick people see a drop in cholesterol when they're sick.
Yeah, that's true too. But how is that reverse causation though?
That it's not the low cholesterol that's causing the heart attack.
No, that's why I said before they had their heart attack, their cholesterol was low. Right. In this study, they measured their cholesterol. They accepted people who had, I think it had to be within the year of having their heart attack. Right. So cholesterol is an acute phase reactant, and it does go down when you have a heart attack. But like everybody is. So many people fall into the category of high risk for heart attack that you can't say that this is a particularly well-selected population, right? That they were particularly sick. So many people have heart attacks now. And yeah, they are the more metabolically unhealthy, but that a year out, I don't think that is legitimate. And you could probably extend the study backwards and you would find the same thing. It's not that as they get sicker, it's as their diet gets worse. their cholesterol drops, right? And where the U-shaped curves have to be the extremes, right? They can't just be like, well, a middle of the road low cholesterol, right? Like a U-shaped curve would be like the lower cholesterol of, of under 50 or something like, or under 70, right? That would be an extreme. But the folks at that point in time, low cholesterol was not defined as 70. It was defined as something like 120 or 140 at that particular time. So most people at that point in time had cholesterol levels around 100, which is
Hmm.
right kind of in the middle of the population. So it's not any kind of unusual number. It's not like an outlier. It's not on the U of the curve. This is just the average person with what we would consider a normal cholesterol level. The higher the higher their cholesterol, the less likely, and this seems to be protective of heart attacks. And how could that be? Well, oxidative stress. Once you follow the oxidative stress is what lowers cholesterol.
Hmm.
So
So how do you think
oxidative stress
people
causes heart attacks.
so how do you think people should think about their cholesterol? People I think getting labs are important. You always want to be able to see what's going on under the hood. Um, is that a number that you think should be like ignored, or what's
Yes.
your?
LDL cholesterol should be ignored. The numbers that we should be paying attention to are HDL and triglycerides, right? And if your LDL is high, like 200, 300, if your diet is healthy, that isn't a problem. And if your LDL cholesterol is low, could that be a problem? Well, I think so. If your LDL cholesterol is low, however, very often, unless you're medicated, you're going to have, higher triglycerides and lower HDL. So triglycerides should be about equal to HDL, and they should be both between 50 and 100.
You want your HDL high. You want your triglycerides low. Metabolic markers are likely also important, right? Like your fasting blood glucose, fasting insulin,
Those two are
homocysteine.
extremely important.
Hmm.
Homocysteine, it can be kind of like confusing because people take supplements these days, and so many supplements have things, have B vitamins in them, and so I'm not sure about that. But yeah, I check it anyway, right? But I also do it in context of asking them, what are you supplementing with, and what is your diet like, and all this. So I don't routinely check it just because it's not I haven't like found it to be a rock solid, useful number. Um, and yeah, so other things that I think are really important. I guess it's going to vary, but like your omega 6 to omega 3 ratio can be an indicator of oxidative stress because
Hmm.
omega 3 will go down before omega 6 will go down. So you'll have a skewed ratio. You'll have very low, like DHEA, these omega 3s that are the most polyunsaturated. They've got so many double bonds. They're so easily destroyed by oxygen. Well, when your body is not healthy, those will be depleted. And so you'll see that in like a low omega 3 to omega 6 ratio on one of those types of labs. And then
Hmm.
I look at blood counts and I look at comprehensive metabolic profile just for some other indicators of overall nutrition and organ health and basic stuff like that.
Yeah. Love it. Very interesting, Dr. Cate. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me on and asking such good questions. I never know like how like much people are into what's going on social media versus you know versus like the standard way of thinking. I knew you were way beyond the standard way of thinking, but you're more into the social media buzz about these things than I am. So thank you for
Well,
enlightening me.
yeah, I'm probably too online, but I'm invested in this, for no other reason than I want to live a long time and be healthy and do what I can to reduce suffering in the world and to help my audience. We live in a very confusing time. There's, everybody has a voice now on social media, um, I have no dog in this fight other than the fact that, I personally avoid refined bleach and deodorized seed oils. I've talked about it. I've talked about them many times in the past, uh, and I've expressed my concern about the relative dearth of research relating them to long-term brain health, which is a particular passion of mine. It's just a huge, you know, it's like Pandora's black box.
You
Eh,
will like, okay, if when you read chapter the two, actually, of vegetable oils, there's a section called the garbage catastrophe. And I talk about how animal studies that recreate the deposits that we find in people with amyloid, they cannot recreate that unless they use polyunsaturated fatty acids in their diet.
wow, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I grew up consuming this stuff. I grew up consuming corn oil and margarine instead of butter. My mom was always very concerned about heart disease. So whatever the messaging was about how to eat a heart healthy diet in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I mean, that's how I grew up eating. So decades of seed oil consumption in my house. And I'll never know what caused my mom's disease, but my mom had dementia for many years and had very poor
Yeah.
health.
And the brain is kind of the canary in the coal mine for oxidative stress, right? And so, because our brain is so filled up with polyunsaturated fatty acids, it needs the most antioxidants. And so, I think that's why we're seeing mental disorders going through the roof in millennials. I think that's why we're seeing so many children born who are not neurotypical. And I definitely, it is absolutely, oxidative stress is a root cause of all disease. And these oils can promote oxidative stress more powerfully than anything else. So if you want to like finger oxidative stress is the root cause. I'm not saying vegetable oil is the root cause, but vegetable oil promotes it more powerfully than any other single thing in our food supply. And we're eating so much. It's just, and no doubt your mom, unfortunately, was probably eating more than, you know, is healthier, more than her body could sustain because of all the what we all grew up with back in the 70s and 80s and starting in the 60s. There was direct to consumer advertising for polyunsaturates. They used the word in magazines,
Hmm.
polyunsaturates, and that was what they were heart healthy. And so I have no doubt that if you take those things out of the food supply, so many people suffering from dementia right now would magically have never gotten it
Hmm.
because these are the most powerful driver of oxidative stress. You can still get sick, but it's a lot harder. You have to really eat a lot of sugar and a lot of, empty calories without these things in. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also talk about just the role of overcooking, right? You don't want to overcook your food on a
You don't
habitual.
want to, yeah. Well, when you overcook meat, I mean, it creates on the surface like these like carcinogens and things like that, which your
And
body has to.
vegetables. Did
And
you know that happens with vegetables too?
I think I heard that, but so the same compounds, the same because people always point
Same
a finger
idea.
at meat.
Yeah, no, it's absurd to point it at meat, but yeah, it's all hydrocarbons, right? It's all like it's all basically the only difference with meat is it has more nitrogen, and nitrogen is more reactive.
Hmm.
So this is why chemistry, like, actually is so important. And my way of thinking about nutrition, it's foundation. I always check with the chemistry first, and if it's breaking a rule of chemistry, I have to question it. But yeah, so oxidative stress, if you overcook your vegetables, you're destroying a lot of the antioxidants that they have, right? Anything black, smoking, that's less nutritious than, you know, before it smokes and turns black.
Yeah, you're right. Well, I really appreciate that you're pushing the envelope on this topic. I think it's scientific. We have to be able to have these conversations and challenge the status quo because the status quo today is illness, and
Right.
it's really unfortunate. And I never want to appear like one of these like social media clout chasers who's just pushing the envelope in favor of the status quo. Um, and big food, because I feel like at the end of the day, they don't have your back. You are the one to have your own back. And I think, we need to be thinking outside of the box with these kinds of conditions, which seem to be, for anybody diagnosed, I mean, it's such a hopeless scenario, and the tools of Western medicine, once you're actually diagnosed, once you've received that diagnosis, can be so limited.
And dangerous.
Yeah.
Right? Like there was
potentially, yeah.
drug that was the drug for amyloid beta actually increased deaths.
Brain
right?
bleeding and brain swelling.
Bleeding.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that didn't, that didn't stop them from approving it.
No.
Because that was actually shown before it was approved.
Yeah. I think they finally pulled it, maybe.
They did. It's now.
They did.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But they're making more. They're making more similar ones, and they won't help. So we have to be our own, we have to act as though the world is trying to make us unhealthy, because that's the number one, financial route to success these days. The healthcare industry is the number one industry in the country, driving our economy. Healthcare lobbying is the number one, wealthiest lobbying industry. And so you have to think for yourself, and you have to, if you want to be healthy, you have to understand the root cause. And that's why I wrote Dark Calories, because it's not something doctors are talking about. Nobody's really talked about oxidative stress as being the single most important root cause, or the role of vegetable oil in promoting oxidative stress and all of these diseases that are all related. They're all related, because if they all have their roots in oxidative stress, and the oxidative stress is driven by a bad diet, they are all related to each other. And that's another thing with a chronic, the all-you-can-eat buffet of chronic disease is, you're going to end up with some kind of chronic disease on your plate. You just don't know what it is that biology has chosen for you.
Well, thanks for coming on. I got one last question for you before we get to that. Where can people pick up Dark Calories, and where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, so Dark Calories is available on Amazon and other major booksellers. My website is drcate.com, drcate.com, and that's my main online existence. I'm not great on social media, but I'm there on Twitter. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. Also, same handle. It's at drcate Shanahan, my last name.
Love it. Love it. Last question that gets asked everybody on the show. What does living a genius life mean to you?
It means not letting other people tell me what's what, I guess. I'm a rebel, and I have to think for myself. I do question everything, just about everything. Once I think of it, once I realize, oh, I've been living as though X is true. Let's see if X is really true. So you do have to be, I had to be a rebel myself to make medicine meaningful, because it wasn't. And now practicing the way I do is meaningful to me. And so I think that was maybe a genius move.
I think so too. I very much appreciate that. Well, thank you, Dr. Cate, for coming onto the show. Means a lot, and glad we got to connect. I've been familiar with your work for some time. So, hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.